Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my tree.
Episode 140, The Double Hanging. Just a warning, there is some graphic information contained in this episode. On the 31st of May 1894, Nosey Bob Howard, New South Wales executioner, supervised a double execution at Darlinghurst jail. The two men, known as the Bridge Street Burglars, were Thomas Williams, alias Thomas Carroll, and Charles Montgomery, alias Thomas Millidge. Charles Montgomery, alias Thomas Millidge, was born John Thomas Millidge in Hotham, Victoria in 1863, to Charles Millidge and Jane Greasley, and had the nickname Buck. Later, he assumed the alias Charles Montgomery. His New South Wales jail record stated he was born in New Zealand in 1864, but this was no doubt fabricated to cover his real identity. His father, Charles Millidge, was born in London in 1827 and died at the age of 47 in 1874. Jane Millidge died on the 22nd of October, 1876. So by the time John was 13, his parents had passed away. John Millidge had a sister, Jane Elizabeth Millidge, who was born in 1855 in Melbourne. She married Thomas Tonkin in Brunswick in 1881 and had 6 children with him. Jane died in Coburg, Victoria, on the 31st of December 1932 at the age of 77. He also had a brother, Peter Millidge, who was born in 1855. Peter married Mary Ann Eastway Field in 1877 in Victoria. He was a compositor who lived in Hotham and died at the age of 70 in Coburg in 1925. John Millidge's jail record said he was a labourer and he had the tattoo KG and other distinct marks on his lower left arm. As an 11-year-old on the 8th of May 1874, it said 4 boys whose ages ranged between 11 and 14 and whose names were Thomas Millidge, William Maybrick, Robert Newbold and Joseph Johnston were charged with larceny. His Victorian jail record also stated he received a prior conviction on the 29th of November 1876 when he was 13 of 1 month's jail. In February 1877, he was charged with being a rogue and a vagabond and he was only 14 at the time and tried at the Hotham Petty Sessions and jailed for 3 months with labour. On the 3rd of February 1877 it outlined this conviction. Hotham Police Court. At the Hotham Police Court on Thursday, 3 lads named Thomas Millidge, John Greben and James Duggan, aged respectively 14, 15 and 16, were charged with being in a public place with intent to commit a felony. A robbery was committed at the house of Mr. S. Carter of Chapman Street, Hotham, and the prisoners were seen leaving the house in the same evening. The stolen property was not discovered, and after the prisoners had been several times remanded on a charge of housebreaking, the charge was altered. The prisoners, Millidge and Duggan, who'd previously been convicted for larceny, were sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment with hard labour. His next conviction occurred only 4 months later in June 1877, being charged with being a rogue and vagabond, and he now received 12 months' jail with hard labour. In August 1878, barely time out of jail, he was again charged with the same offence and received 18 months' hard labour. So on the 30th of August 1878, this was put in print. Thomas Millidge, a youth of 17 who served 2 previous sentences as a rogue and a vagabond, was brought up on the charge of attempting to commit a felony. Evidence was given that he visited the shop of Mr. Crichton, a bootmaker of Curzon Street, and tried on a pair of boots. As soon as he had them on, he ran away with them. Several witnesses gave evidence as to the prisoner's shoplifting propensities, and he was sentenced to 18 months' imprisonment with hard labour. Again, not long after he was released from jail, in April 1880, he was charged with resisting a constable and sentenced to 3 months' hard labour or pay a fine. In April 1881, he was charged with being found on a premises and vagrant and jailed for 12 months with hard labour. And it said in the Hotham Court on Monday, a man named Thomas Millidge was sentenced to 12 months' imprisonment with hard labour for being unlawfully on the premises of Mr. Rye. The prisoner's companion was a man named James Duggan, who was arrested on Mr. Rye's premises, the Wheatleaf Hotel, Courtney Street, Hotham, on the night named, who's already been sent to jail for 1 year. In March 1882, he was charged with larceny at the Maryborough Petty Sessions and received 6 months hard labour, a cumulative sentence. And in the Maryborough Standard, it said 2 prisoners, Thomas Millidge and Watson, bolted from the prison labour gang yesterday. The former got clear away, although fired at by the warden, but Watson thought the better of it and gave up. Up to going to press, Millidge had not been captured, although it is believed he's still in the neighbourhood. In May 1883, he was charged with illegally being on a premises at Inglewood Petty Sessions and received 12 months hard labour, and was also charged with stealing money on this date and received a further cumulative sentence of 12 months hard labour. He initially served time in Sandhurst Jail, or Bendigo, for his last offence, and he was then moved to Pentridge in July 1883. And in May 1883, it was recorded the Queen versus Gascoigne ex parte Millidge. In the chambers in Melbourne yesterday, Mr Leon moved His Honour the Chief Justice for a rule nisi to quash a conviction of Thomas Millidge, whereby he was adjudged as idle and disorderly under the Vagrant Act and was sentenced to 12 months imprisonment at Maryborough. The conviction was attacked because the defendant was arrested without previous summons or warrant. His Honour granted a rule nisi to quash the conviction, returnable next term. Referring to this case, in the Maryborough and Dunolly Advertiser on the 11th of May, it said a case of some importance was lately heard at the Maryborough Petty Sessions. Thomas Millidge was charged before the bench at Maryborough with being an idle and disorderly person within the meaning of the vagrancy provisions of the Police Offences Statute. He was convicted and sentenced to 12 months imprisonment. The prisoner remained in custody for 1 week when he was bailed out, pending an appeal to the Sessions. On the 8th of June 1885, the efforts of the police to discover the men who stuck up the Simpsons Road branch of the National Bank on Wednesday have proved successful. 6 men answering the description given by many witnesses have been arrested. The names of the prisoners are Bernard Dunleavy, Thomas Millidge, Thomas McMahon, John Elcock, George Fortune and Alfred Raingill, alias Joseph Yates. Alfred Raingill appeared in episode 105. The details of the trial of this robbery are in depth in episode 105, so I'm just going to mention Millidge's role in this, and I urge you to go back and listen to all of the details of that robbery in that episode. The prisoners are all old criminals. Some women who were found in the same houses as the prisoners and in possession of various articles of jewellery were also arrested by the detectives as a precaution against their disposing of stolen money and any articles that might be used as evidence against the men. The detectives, on searching the prisoners, found golden notes from the National Bank to the amount of £100 on them, a number of gold rings, new watches and chains, and the next day it was recorded in the Melbourne Age. The 5 men, Thomas Millidge, Thomas McMahon, John Alcock, George Fortune and Alfred Rainhill, alias Yates, were arrested on Saturday evening and Sunday morning on charges of vagrancy. They were yesterday seen in the watch house by principal witnesses in the case of the stick-up of the Simpsons Road Bank, and as a result, Reverend Stewart identified Millidge and Caney as 2 of the men he saw leaving the bank premises soon after the robbery. Gorey, a young lamplighter whose father informed the police that he'd seen the men in the cart in Lincoln Street, recognised all the prisoners but McMahon as the men who passed him in the cart. On the strength of the identification of the prisoners, they were yesterday afternoon charged with robbery under arms. The detectives believe that Alcock, Fortune and Millidge stuck the bank up and Yates drove them away. It is believed that McMahon met the others at Studley Park and drove the cart home to his place at Port Melbourne, where they returned on foot. And in the Weekly Times on the 20th of June 1885, the men that committed the daring robbery of £1,000 from the Simpsons Road sub-branch at the National Bank appeared, and it says those that were present was Mr Humphreys, the manager of the bank, who was bound and gagged by the robbers. Mr Humphreys eyed the prisoners curiously, but they were either utterly oblivious at his presence or affected to be, for they nevertheless looked at him. There was toing and froing in this court case, as their defence counsel said that there had not been formal identification of these men at this point. It was here that the hearing had stopped and the companions were removed into custody. Madeline Sullivan, Margaret Welsh, Annie Murray, Eva Bradley and Catherine Ryan, alias Agan, were charged, the first 2 named with being occupiers of disorderly houses and others with being vagrants. It was in Madeline Sutherland's abode in Juliet Terrace that Yates was arrested, and hidden in the bed was £22 and 10 shillings in gold. In the Geelong Advertiser, 2 days later, conviction of the bank robbers. The trial of Thomas Millidge, John Alcock, George Fortune and Thomas McMahon for the robbery under arms of the Simpson Road branch of the National Bank was continued and concluded. Mr McDermott for the defence contended the evidence of the identification was still unsatisfactory and that the testimony of Alfred Raingill, the informer, was not to be relied on. The jury, after 20 minutes deliberation, convicted all four, but in McMahon's case they found him to have been an accessory only. 4 previous convictions were admitted by Millidge, 2 by Alcock and 2 by Fortune and 1 by McMahon. Millidge was asked if he had anything to say and he said no in a half-contemptuous, half-defiant manner. Alcock said a few words which were not audible except in the vicinity of the dock. Fortune handed in a written statement and McMahon, after some hesitation, said a few words, the purport being that he could not expect a fair trial after the impression which must have been produced upon the minds of the jury by the announcement in the papers that he had confessed. He added that he could have brought forward witnesses to prove his innocence but left matter in the hands of his legal adviser. Judge Cope, in passing sentence, that a more audacious robbery had not been committed for a long time. He was not quite sure if the presentment had been framed differently, that the prisoners might not have been tried on a capital charge and very properly hanged. He said that the evidence of the principal witnesses had been fully corroborated and that the doubt as to whether the prisoners were the robbers had been fully removed. He sentenced Millidge, Alcock and Fortune to 6 years' imprisonment with hard labour. A heavier sentence was generally looked for under the circumstances, and the cheerfulness displayed by the prisoners when they heard the sentence showed that they were agreeably surprised. The detectives were inclined to grumble at the leniency shown by His Honour, and as the prisoners are all young men, they will be let out again in the course of a few years, all having the ability for more mischief. Alfred Raingill, to whom the country is indebted for the conviction of the bank robbers, is now a free man, being discharged by the city bench. Now, due to his detention for vagrancy is no longer necessary, he is not unnaturally proposes to try a change of air. So Raingill was the informant and was able to have his conviction quashed as a result. So a little less than 2 years later, the first petition praying for release from penal servitude on the ground that this is the Jubilee year and the quality of mercy should be somewhat strained, reached His Excellency the Governor a few weeks ago. It prayed for the release from custody of Thomas Millidge, who was sentenced to 10 years' imprisonment with hard labour for the Simpsons Road Bank robbery. The man's record, however, was anything but good, and his request to his memento of Her Majesty's Grace was consequently declined. On the 15th of February 1888, he assaulted a warder and was given 1 week's solitary confinement and 6 months added to his sentence. However, he was released with only half of his term served on the 12th of September 1890. On the 22nd of January 1895, though, it records that Millidge was released from jail in September 1890 with a record of being a resourceful, daring and dangerous criminal. He went straight to his old haunts and, although he did no work, appeared in Burke Street almost every day, dressed in well-cut clothes and wearing so many diamonds that his acquaintances dubbed him Diamond Charlie. He remained in Melbourne until early last year, when the Allen, Levy and Thompson robberies were being investigated by the detectives and the hunt for the criminals was keen. He then went over to Sydney. Later information connected Millidge with the tobacco robberies and has shown that in a couple of years he must have acquired a plunder to the value of £3,000 at least. Such a run of success was only possible with a police system in which surveillance was unknown or unpractised. With a system of surveillance, Millidge's movements would have been known, and his clothes and his diamonds and his idleness would have had a significance which would have led to a search of his lodgings and discovery, doubtless enough evidence to have sent him to jail on charge of vagrancy, if no worse, before half of his crimes had been committed. As he was allowed an absolutely free run and lived openly at the house where hundreds' weight of stolen tobacco was stored. On several occasions he even passed through the streets and rode alongside detectives on tramcars with a parcel of stolen tobacco under each arm. In jail, the habitual criminal is a burden to the community. Out of jail, he is a positive danger. And the next time he is recorded is in Sydney as a result of the attempted murder of a constable in Bridge Street and his execution. Thomas Carroll, who was born Thomas Williams, was born in Victoria, in Warrnambool. However, there are other records that say that he was born in New Zealand and came out at the age of 11 from Bluff Harbour on the 6th of November 1887 to Melbourne on the Ringarooma. So he was born in 1886, but unsure whether it was Warrnambool in Victoria or New Zealand. He went by the nickname Curly. On the 18th of April 1880, when he was 14, he was charged with insulting behaviour, assault and larceny. 3 years later, at the age of 17, he was given 2 months and 7 days concurrent sentence for insulting behaviour and assault in Carlton. On the 11th of October and on the 26th of November 1884, he was charged with common assault and received a 5-month cumulative jail sentence. Records show that his mother was Mrs. Annie Carroll of Berkeley Street, Carlton, and his jail papers said that his brother visited him before his execution, and he was also married. On the 2nd of February 1891, he was convicted of shop breaking, and it stated that he had 5 previous convictions and he was sentenced to 3 years hard labour in the Melbourne General Sessions, with every second month in solitary confinement in Pentridge. He was released on the 6th of July 1893. He later assumed the alias of Thomas Williams in New South Wales, but also had the aliases of Thomas Clark, Thomas Call, Thomas Curley and Robert Clark. Now to their offence in Sydney. It says 2 criminals from Melbourne, Charles Montgomery, alias Thomas Millidge, and Thomas Williams, alias Thomas Carroll, were apprehended by police officers after they and a third man broke into the offices of the Union Steamship Company of New Zealand in Bridge Street, Sydney, in the early hours of the 2nd of February 1894. Montgomery and Williams were armed with a revolver and jemmy bars. During an affray with the police in the streets near Circular Quay and the ultimate capture of the 2 criminals, 5 policemen received serious injuries. Of the 5, Constable Frederick Bowden was knocked unconscious with a blow from a jemmy bar and suffered a fractured skull. On the 3rd of April 1894, Montgomery and Williams were convicted of feloniously wounding Constable Bowden with intent to murder him, and both men were sentenced to death. In the New South Wales Sydney Morning Herald on the 3rd of February 1894, it had a detailed account of this event. The Bridge Street affray. The sensational and murderous onslaught on the police in the northern part of the city yesterday morning was throughout the day the principal topic of general conversation in the city and suburbs. To the public, the announcement of the affray came as a shock, and even men who have grown grey in the police force agreed that within their recollection, the circumstances of this deplorable event were unparalleled. This encounter centred in and around the office of the Union Steamship Company of New Zealand Limited at 15 Bridge Street, situated opposite the Queensland offices. The night watchman for the company, at about 12:30am while he was doing his rounds of inspection, took notice that the back door of the Union SS Company's premises was closed. An hour later he observed that this door was slightly ajar, but that it would not open. He therefore remained in the vicinity for 3/4 of an hour. The watchman added that he felt sure that something was wrong because one of the lights of the new premises had been turned nearly out and that the immediate locality had been brought to a state of almost total darkness. They heard a stampede out the front of the building and shouts of police. The constables and watchmen rushed into Bridge Street, but by this time the burglars who had been in the building were being hotly pursued. Senior Constable Ball, about 5 minutes past 2 o'clock, was standing on the corner of George and Bridge Streets in the company of Senior Constable McCourt when he saw 3 men suddenly appear in Bridge Street, about halfway between George and Pitt Streets. He exclaimed to McCourt, "Hello, where did those fellows come from?" McCourt replied, "I think they came out of one of those doorways." Grasping the situation, Senior Constable Ball said, "I'll go down Bridge Street, you'd go down Queen's Place and we'll catch them. I'll follow them." Ball went smartly down the street, and when he came to Union SS Company's offices, he found the front door open. By this time, the 3 men had gone as far as Pitt Street, and they turned the corner at once. Just as they got round the corner, they spied Senior Constable McCord coming to meet them, so they shot across the road and along Bridge Street in the direction of the Lands Department. The 2 senior constables resumed company and followed the men and the officers, noting that Constable Lyons was ahead, ran up towards the 3 men and called upon them to stand, which the trio of fugitives would not do. Immediately after this, McCourt came up to the men and demanded, "Where are you going?" McCourt was in the act of getting his hands onto one of the trio, afterwards identified as Charles Montgomery, whom he received a terrible blow on the head from a jemmy, which fell him to the ground. Constable Lyons, seeing how his comrade had been used, also rushed at Montgomery, and the jemmy again was raised to keep him off. Deliberate aim was taken at the constable's head, but the officer put up his right arm for protection. The limb received the full force of the blow, which was so savagely given that the constable staggered under it and his arm fell, disabled by his side. Montgomery advanced a few steps towards him and struck him out again with a jemmy, but Lyons dodged out and escaped the hit. The 3 men then ran off, Lyons approaching Senior Constable McCourt to assist him if required, but the senior constable urged him to go on, go on. Lyons thereupon joined Senior Constable Ball in the chase. The three fugitives turned towards Bridge Street into Loftus Street, closely followed by Senior Constable Ball. The senior constable had got close up and was gaining ground at every stride when Montgomery turned around, presented a revolver at him and defiantly shouted, "If you follow me another yard, I'll blow your brains out." The officer, however, was not to be balked, and Montgomery, seeing that was so, and that his companions had got a long way ahead of him, faced about and hurried after them, keeping the revolver at his hand. Senior Constable Ball redoubled his energies and shouted for help. From Loftus Street, the men ran into Bent Street and thence into Young Street, at which point Constable Bowden came upon them. He tried to block the way, but was dealt with a tremendous blow on the head with a jemmy, which knocked him unconscious. Having again cleared their path, the three desperadoes turned up Bridge Street. Constable Taylor came to assist. He outpaced the fugitives, but he too, on coming up with them, was assaulted by the jemmy, a weapon which was carried in concealment by each of the three men. Constable Taylor, like most of his comrades, was knocked down by the blow. On the three men arriving at the corner of Bridge and Phillips Streets, there were some men at work on the tramway. Two turned down Phillips Street towards Circular Quay, while three rushed straight ahead into Macquarie Street and the Domain. The turn into Phillips Street was fatal for the two men who made it. That they should have taken such a course is a matter of general surprise, as the Water Police Station is situated in the portion of the thoroughfare which was negotiated. The movement is unexplained by a surmise, which is confirmed by officers of the police force, that the two men were comparatively new to Sydney. The third man, who had believed to have been acting the part of guide all through, evidently was too well posted to do such a thing, and he remained at large. It was in Phillips Street that Constable Elford came upon the men. He caught hold of one of the two men, who afterwards gave his name as Thomas Williams, but unfortunately the coat which the fellow was wearing was too flimsy to bear the momentary strain. The coat pocket, together with the handkerchief which was in it, came away in Elford's hands. Before Elford could make another attempt to secure the man, he received a heavy blow which knocked him to the ground. Senior Constable Ball was forging his way ahead all the time and shouted loudly as so he could attract the attention of the Water Police. When right opposite the station, he managed to close in on Montgomery, but he too received a blow. Aim had been taken at his head with a jemmy, but Ball put up his left arm. The blow struck his arm just below the elbow and caused a nasty bruise on the forehead. Ball again closed in on Montgomery, and as this time they were both somewhat exhausted, they fell onto the road. Montgomery was the first to rise, and he was in the act again of making an attack on Senior Constable Ball, when Senior Constable Scott leapt out of the station just in time to stop the blows. Ball and Scott together managed, after a violent struggle on Montgomery's part, to get him into the station, and simultaneously Constables Clappell, McCroaks and Daniels, who had also rushed from the lockup, tackled the second man and took him captive. The struggles of the prisoners in the street lasted about 6 or 7 minutes and were of most furious description. In the tussles which took place, Montgomery came off very badly. Bleeding and cut, he presented a scary figure under the light of the station. Once inside, however, he, like Williams, gave up further hope of freedom and became resigned. The jemmies were taken charge of by the police. Also upon the two men were 2 skeleton keys, 2 pocket knives converted into saws, and a pair of pincers. Montgomery had in his possession a new 5-chambered revolver which was fully loaded. An examination of his clothing brought to light about a dozen extra cartridges which fitted the weapon. The jemmies were implements of a most formidable description. Each measured 2 foot in length and weighed 6.5 pounds. The deadly work which they're capable of is easily understood from a single glance at them. Constable Frederick Bowden appeared at the time to have suffered the most severe injuries. He had a cut 3 inches long on the left eye. This wound extended to the bone. There was another cut above the left ear, at which point the skull was fractured. A small piece of bone had to be removed, and after this was done, the patient was put to bed in one of the wards. Bowden is a native of South Australia and has only been 3 years in the colony. He is now serving his 2nd year in the police force. Bowden's recovery depends on whether the brain has been lacerated or otherwise injured. Fractures of the skull are always dangerous. Constable Thomas Lyons was taken to the hospital with a fracture of his right elbow. Constable Taylor had a wound on the back of his head. The injury was 2 inches in length and extended to the bone, and he also had an abrasion of the nose. Constable Elford had a 4-inch long cut extending to the bone above his left eye, and he also was developing symptoms of internal injuries. Senior Constable McCourt had a wound 2 inches long on the right side of his forehead. During the morning, his condition became serious and throughout the day had to be sedated. The 2 prisoners were taken to the Water Police Court at 10:30. The more burly-looking man of the 2 was described on the charge sheet as Charles Montgomery, 30 years of age, no occupation, native of New Zealand. His companion, Thomas Williams, 21 years of age, labourer, native of Victoria. Charles Montgomery, however, was afterwards identified as being Thomas Millidge or Thomas Carroll. Though the 2 men were not of equally powerful build, both seemed to bear the attributes of devotees in the ring. In each case, the nose was not what nature had intended. Both of them had been flattened by some agency or another, Montgomery's especially so. Montgomery's cheekbones stood out with great prominence, and as the prisoner scowled around the court, he looked about in a fierce manner. He had a wound under his left eye. Williams's features were not so pronounced. This man, however, is a thick-set individual. The court was packed with people, and there were large crowds outside. The men were first charged together with having broken into the premises of the Union SS Company in Bridge Street. Then Montgomery was charged with maliciously wounding Senior Constable McCourt with intent to commit murder, and Williams having maliciously wounded Constable John Elford with intent to murder. Later they were transferred to Darlinghurst Jail. It was discovered later that the burglars had burst into the back door of the business, entered the lavatory and gained access to the accountant's room, the main office and the head clerk's office. In the last named apartment, a massive safe stands about 6 foot high, and it was found to have been thrown on its face and on top of the ledgers and other books that had been arranged on the floor to break the fall of the safe and to deaden the noise. The back was off the safe and some jewellery, which the company was holding, was strewn on the floor. A cash box containing £2 15 shillings was laid embedded under some books and had not been discovered. In this room, belonging to the head clerk, was found suspended over the fan light, an article to prevent the glare of the light within while the burglars were at work, without being seen in the lane. In the main office, a second safe had been overturned with the same care and by the same means as in the other case. Some bloodstains outside the back door of the premises seemed to indicate that one of the men must have hurt himself in breaking the door open. Some of the burglars' implements were discovered lying about the offices. The articles included a strong chisel and half a bootmaker's iron last, which admirably serves in each case as the purpose of a hammer. Another article was a bottle of oil used to facilitate the working of the saws. To make good their exit on hearing the voices in the lane at the rear of the premises, the burglars had broken open the swing doors of the lobby leading to Bridge Street and let themselves onto the street by drawing back the catch of the outer door. It is supposed the burglars anticipated securing a large amount of cash, the receipts of passage money and freight, per the steamship Mararoa, which had sailed that day for New Zealand. In this, however, they had reckoned without their hosts, for a strict rule for the Union Steamship Company of New Zealand is that no cash be allowed to remain in the offices of the company. As a matter of fact, the cash that was found on the premises at the time of the burglary was such a small amount that it constituted only a fractional portion of what had been received during the day. In other words, it was petty cash. Even if the robbers succeeded in opening the safes, there would not have been enough for their trouble, much less having constituted anything like a prize. The proprietor of the hotel on the corner of Pitt and Bridge Street stated that on Thursday morning just before noon, the man called Montgomery, a man like Williams and a smart-looking young fellow in a light suit, whose conversation showed that he was familiar with the locality, were in the bar. 2 of them were about Hamilton Lane all day. Mr. William Pooley, the watchman in charge of the block, who came on duty at 10 o'clock, noticed that 3 or 4 suspicious-looking individuals were loitering about the ill-lighted and not particularly odorous lanes that are within a short distance of the main business centres of the city. He is paid a few shillings a week by the proprietors of different establishments in patrolling the block, which is backed by Bridge Lane, with Bridge Street in front and George Street and Hamilton Lane on the either side. He apparently had felt that the locality under his particular jurisdiction was ill-served with lights. He had placed a kerosene lamp on the boarding just opposite the back entrance to the Union Company's office. On Friday night, the frequent reappearance of men of an inquisitive turn of mind made him uneasy, and he consulted the constable, P.C. MacArthur, a young officer full of zeal for the first time he'd taken charge of one of the most difficult beats in the city. Paul saw the constable at 10 o'clock and agreed that they should meet when the post office clock struck successive quarters, but his rounds prevented him adhering to the fixed time of appointment. At 11 o'clock, he returned to do his patrol He knew the lock was a feeble one on the Union SS Company's office. He pressed again and there was no rattle and the door was firm, and he concluded the burglars were inside. I know the door was shaky, and when I found it was like a brick wall, I knew something was wrong. So I called out to the police, and he'd observed that his kerosene lamp had been turned down previously. We then heard scuffling. We both tried the door and found that it had been propped up by a block of wood inside. I assumed that when we called for the police, they heard both of us. Millidge came over from Melbourne 3 weeks ago, and Carroll has only been seen in Sydney for a week. They're both said to belong to a clever and notorious gang of Melbourne robbers. The third man is believed to be one of the same gang who is at present in Sydney, but is not yet known which member of the gang he is. Police officials say that both men are clever and determined burglars. And on the 5th of February 1894, with an account of the prisoners, Charles Montgomery, or Thomas Millidge, is a most desperate character and frequently boasted in Melbourne that he would never be captured alive. When he was lodged in the station after his desperate resistance to the constables, he remarked to the police standing around him that no single constable will ever take him alive. The Melbourne police, knowing of his threat, therefore were always armed themselves, as they did not consider their lives were safe when an encounter seemed probable between them and Millidge, who was always known to go about housebreaking work armed. At present, Williams is wanted in Melbourne on suspicion of being concerned in safe robberies there. He and his companion are most dangerous criminals and expert burglars. It is thought they were connected with some ferocious desperados who were known as Spud Murphy's gang, who 6 years ago committed several burglaries and assaults with violence in and around Melbourne. The surname of the leader of the gang was Murphy, and he was dubbed Spud. He was a very violent character, 5'7", 30 years of age, and a stouter build than Williams, whose proper name is considered to be Carroll. Owing to the determined assaults made on warders by prisoners at Pentridge, the jail authorities of that place and the Melbourne police are by no means displeased that the two men, if convicted on these present charges, will be imprisoned at a distance from their associates in crime. The arrival here of the two men was known to the Melbourne detectives, and Inspector Brown at once communicated with the Sydney police, giving particulars of the dangerous character of the men and saying that it was very probable that they would commit a daring outrage in Sydney. The Melbourne detectives were informed that Millidge and Williams's gang intended raiding a large warehouse in that city and were in waiting for them. The desperados did not take part in the expected job but came to Sydney. The two men with two others were strongly suspected of having committed several burglaries in Melbourne recently, and in each instance were armed with revolvers. No action could be taken against them owing to the incomplete evidence of identification. It is thought that Millidge, who has half a dozen aliases, was implicated in the sensational attacks made near Melbourne a few months ago on two bookmakers, Levy and Allen, at their residence. Revolvers were presented by the burglars, which stopped resistance on the part of the bookmakers. The mode of robbery carried out at their two houses is exactly the kind of job that Millidge would put up. And on the 29th of May 1894, Williams' mother's petition. It appears the real name of the convict Williams is Thomas Carroll. Since his condemnation, he's been visited by his mother, an elderly woman who resides in Victoria. She signed a petition begging for Williams' reprieve as Annie M. Carroll, the broken-hearted mother. She bears with her a number of testimonials as to character. One of these was signed by H. Heathershaw, Primitive Methodist minister of Carlton in Melbourne, stating that Williams was brought up a Wesleyan and as a boy was a regular attendant at Sunday school. He is, the letter declares, the only one of the family who is not highly respectable, and his misdeeds are attributed to bad companionships. The Reverend Edward Isaac, Baptist minister of West Melbourne, testifies to the thorough respectability of Mrs. Carroll and the other members of the family, but adds that Williams has always been the black sheep of the flock. In her petition, Mrs. Carroll stated that her son's boyhood was moral, with religious training, which he faithfully attended to, and while he was under her direct control, he was well behaved. He worked as a blacksmith in Melbourne until he yielded to the evil influence of unhappily acquired associates, after which time he fell into a bad course. He has a wife and two children of tender years. One clause in the petition stated that although Montgomery is an utter stranger to the unhappy mother, she pleads for a merciful consideration in his case, and mention is made of the fact that the jury recommended Williams to mercy. And on the 1st of June 1894, intimation of their fate was conveyed to the condemned burglars yesterday. Montgomery received it calmly, but Williams was much moved. He screamed and said he was innocent of the charge and was very much excited and upset. He said he did not intend to kill the constable, and when left by the governor of the jail and the sheriff, he was completely unstrung. He afterwards became quieter, and after a visit from his spiritual adviser, Reverend Austin, he seemed fairly resigned to his fate. Montgomery was also seen by Canon Rich, and his attitude of calmness has not altered. So in the Newcastle Morning Herald, last hours of the men. Montgomery yesterday wrote 3 letters to his brother and 2 sisters. To a married sister in Victoria, he wrote in most affectionate terms and signed the letter, "Your repentant brother, Thomas Millidge." During his incarceration, Montgomery received a number of letters from his sister, and it has transpired that his brother-in-law, just before last Christmas, pressed him to go and work on a farm, but he refused, preferring to pursue his old life. His personal property, a watch and a chain, and sleeve links are left to his brother, who yesterday evening returned to Melbourne after a short visit to Sydney. Yesterday afternoon, the wife of Williams, with their 2 little girls, visited him and remained with him until 5 o'clock, when an affecting farewell between the father and children took place. The unfortunate mother saw her husband for the last time later in the evening, and a painfully affecting interview took place. He was also visited by his brother. Late at night, he spent considerable time in silent prayer. Williams wrote to no one at the last and left no personal property. Both men made a request that a copy of their photographs should be sent to their brothers, sisters, wife and mother. They each cut off a lock of hair. Montgomery expressed the wish that this should be sent to his sister. Williams asked that the piece of hair should be forwarded to his wife. It remains with the jail authorities whether the request with regard to the photographs shall be complied with. Curly Carroll confessed before the execution that he and Millidge had been concerned in many robberies in Melbourne, notably the sticking up of Mr. Barney Allen and Mr. Levy, the bookmakers. In the Maitland Weekly Mercury, there's a full account of the execution of the men. After an extended trial, the men were sentenced to death, and the verdict met with general approval. However, of late, a feeling has been growing that the penalty threatened was too severe for the offence, and movements in their favour resulted in petitions being drawn up, making a remission of punishment, those being signed by members of Parliament and the general public, with over 25,000 signatures obtained. The petitions were backed up by deputations to Sir George Dibbs, with appeals to the executive, and mass demonstrations and processions in Sydney on Wednesday evening. But despite all this, the Premier and the government remained obdurate, and Williams and Montgomery, or Carroll and Millidge, suffered their crime on Thursday morning at Darlinghurst. And the account says the men passed a good night and slept soundly until 6 a.m. when they arose and had a good breakfast. Both were firm and collected. After breakfast, Williams joined in prayer with Reverend Austin, and from the convict's cell could be heard his voice singing A Day's March Near Home. Prayer and devotion continued until close upon the hour of the execution, when he was thoroughly fortified and submitted himself to the last attention of the executioner quite unmoved. Montgomery, who was attended by Canon Rich, preserved a cold, callous demeanour throughout. A few minutes to 9 o'clock, Howard, the hangman, with an attendant, pinioned the condemned men, who said nothing and submitted quietly to the operation. Slowly and solemnly, the small procession moved to the scaffold from the condemned cells. As Montgomery emerged from the corridor and walked towards the structure, he glanced a lot at heaven and of his own accord stepped onto position under the fatal noose. Not a word was spoken, and save the subdued movements of the executioner performing his ghastly duties, not a sound broke the solemn stillness. William's demeanour was one of resignation and calmness throughout. He walked quietly to his doom without a sigh. When the opportunity came, they had nothing to say. The ropes were adjusted, but when Howard gave the signal for his assistant to pull the lever, the rope attached to Williams caught under his left arm and caused his body to tilt over and kick Montgomery. Williams then fell sideways with the rope passing round his neck and under his arm. In this position, the poor wretch struggled and kicked violently, whilst Montgomery's death was instantaneous. For 2 minutes, Williams' struggles were horrible to look at, and it was not until the assistant hangman walked to the scaffold and by shaking the rope violently was able to release it from his arm. It was clear that Williams was not dead, but was gradually being suffocated. The struggles and nervous twitchings lasted a full 8 minutes. After hanging for about 20 minutes, the men were examined by Dr. O'Connor and pronounced their life extinct and their bodies were cut down. Evidently, the men were given the wrong ropes. Montgomery, who was the tallest man, was given a drop of 10 feet. Williams was given 8 feet. An immense crowd assembled outside the jail, but were very orderly. The drop must have, in the opinion of those present, almost broken Williams' neck had his arm not caught, but those who saw him just before the drop said it was almost uncertain he died from shock, as he did not utter the slightest moan. Montgomery displayed great fervour and at the last nod made his peace with God. He maintained the same fortitude which marked him during his incarceration. Williams, when he found all hope was gone, made up his mind and prayed fervently throughout the night and morning. Reverend Austin stated that Williams left a large number of messages of love to his relatives. To his mother and wife he left loving farewells. There is no doubt that a mistake was made in giving Williams a short drop, and this, combined with the bungle of the rope catching under his arm, it caused the man's protracted death. The hangman is to be called to account for such an unpardonable mistake. So far, the jail authorities have not received application for possession of either of the bodies from the relatives, but it's believed Williams's wife, who recently arrived from Melbourne, has written to the Premier making a request. Montgomery informed a friend from Victoria who saw him the other day that the allegation about Williams having threatened to shoot Barney Allen when they broke into the latter's house in Melbourne was incorrect. He stated the facts of the case were that they shadowed the house for some time and one night, in the absence of Mrs. Allen, broke in and searched the house right through for money and jewellery. Failing to find valuables, they went into the bedroom where Allen was sleeping. They tickled his feet with a revolver until they roused him and demanded all of his money. Neither of them threatened to shoot him. All they wanted was the swag. It is considered that just before the trapdoors were opened, Williams fell backwards, as he was on the eve of fainting several times. This caused the rope to slip round under his arm. They said it was an accident that nobody could prevent. The hangman had satisfactorily explained to him the cause of the hitch of the execution, and the sheriff considered that the dying struggles of Williams did not last more than 4 minutes. The rope jammed under his arm was only there a minute before it was released by Goldrick. Mr. Cowper said at 10 o'clock last night he received an intimation that Montgomery had made a request to speak to Williams. This request was communicated to the Premier and the Attorney-General, who advised the Sheriff to accede the request. The warders in charge of Montgomery were somewhat dubious about allowing Montgomery out of his cell, as they feared he had a down on Williams and might do him harm. The Sheriff therefore cautioned Montgomery when he was being conducted to Williams' cell. Neither spoke for some moments, and they seemed to experience some difficulty in commencing a conversation. However, Montgomery at length said to his companion, "Tim, I want to ask you if it is a fact you put me away as well as some of your mates." "No, I did not," replied Williams. "I might have said you should have told me that you were going to do, as I was a married man." "Well," replied Montgomery, "I did not think of that. I thought you were quite able to look after yourself." He then went on to say, "I am sure I did not stand over Constable Bowden or strike those blows, as the constables have sworn." "No," answered Williams, "they have sworn untruths on that matter. Besides, we never had any intention of killing anyone." "It's no use complaining now," went on Montgomery. "I am quite prepared to die and meet my God. Are you?" "I think so," said Williams. "It's not use thinking," said Montgomery. "You ought to be sure." They then spoke of matters concerning their past life. The hanging of Montgomery and Williams provoked political storms and legal tumult. These raged before and during the trial and long after the criminals were buried in their paupers' graves. And in 1951, there was an account of what Buck and Curley got up to in Melbourne. It said in 1891 they perfected a system that enabled them to pay regular visits to the racecourse, invariably to beat the bookies and wind up with a substantial winner. It was Curley and Buck's thoughtful habit to choose a winning bookie and tail him to his city or suburban residence. There, after giving the bagman time to change himself into slippers and count up his profits, the devoted couple would enter the house and demand the generous contribution from the surprise bookie. The business concluded, and the lucky punters departed after warning their victim that a squeal to the police would hasten his death and bring sorrow to his family. In other words, Curley and Buck were the pioneers of the stand-over technique in Australia. If the bookie resisted, he was beaten up and robbed.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.